Good afternoon. Welcome to today's special edition webinar. We've been, of course, doing the learning lunches on the first Fridays for the most part, but we were pleased to be able to have space for the Small and Rural Schools Committee. And so Liz and I, who handle, we know not all of the rural schools in Massachusetts, but many of the rural schools in Massachusetts, are really pleased here to be introducing you to the co-chairs of the Rural School Committee. So that's Martha Thurber, who I know many of you know of the Mohawk Trail Regional School Committee, and Jessica Corwin, who's both on Sunderland and on the Frontier Regional School Committee. And Liz and I are going to duck out and turn it over to the two of them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and thank you, MASC, for giving us this opportunity, making time for us to talk about rural school needs. We want to acknowledge off the bat that rural schools have many, if not all, of the same needs as non-rural districts. We all need, special education funding reform. We need fully funded circuit breaker. We need charter school reimbursement. We need transportation assistance. We're all constrained by Prop 2.5. Those are pretty universal. But there are some things that are really unique to rural schools, things that we are struggling with. And so we want to lead off with one essential difference. If you only remember one thing from today, we want you to know that it costs more per student to provide a basic education in small districts than in larger ones. If you have a public school, you need to have a superintendent and a business manager and a special education director and a principal and a school nurse and a school custodian and a school secretary, regardless of whether your school building has 600 kids or 100 kids. When the rural schools report came out in 2022, they decided the appropriate over-under figure for the analysis of comparison was 1,300 students. If you have a district with fewer than 1,300 students, on average, it costs 16.7% more per student to provide that basic education. And if it's a regional school, it's 22.7% more. This is a reality that is not accounted for in Chapter 70 funding formulas, leaving rural schools very far behind in the state aid that we receive relative to our needs. So to introduce ourselves, yes, I'm Jessica Corwin, chair of the Sunderland School Committee. Sunderland is the town just north of Amherst, where the UMass flagship campus is. We're a right to farm community. I'm also on the Frontier Regional School Committee, which is a 7 through 12 regional. And I came to my school committee work because I'm a teacher. At the time I first ran for school committee, I was teaching in a rural school district and was shocked by how things were going. So I decided to run for school committee in my own town. I now teach in Springfield. And I'd like to introduce Martha, my co-chair.
Hi, I'm Martha Thurber. I'm the chair of the Mohawk Trail Regional School District. We are the largest regular school district in the state. I have 16 members on my committee. We are composed of 8 towns, and we're a pre-K to 12 regional school district. You want to go to the next one? And this kind of shows you where my district is and how large it is. We are actually larger than the 10 districts that have the most student population in the state. So we are larger than those 10 districts combined. We have about 1,850 students pre-K to 12. So our total population of our 8 towns is somewhere around 11,000 people, all in.
And I also wanted to note, so Martha and I are in neighboring regional districts. Hers has 8 towns, mine has 4. We're both serving a resident population of 10 to 11,000 people combined. Because we are both in superintendency unions, Martha's 10,000 person population has to find 22 people to serve on school committees, and my 10,000 population has to find 25 individuals willing to serve on school committees, which is something substantially different from other school districts. So now that we've given you this general orientation to what we're talking about today, here's our specific agenda. We'll talk about the history of identifying and analyzing rural school challenges. We'll talk about what those are, some proposed solutions, some of which are more realistic than others. We'll talk about how some of the concerns of rural schools are the same as non-rural districts and how those relate to the Rural Schools Bill. And then we'll update you on the activity of the Rural Schools Committee and hopefully have a little time for Q&A at the end.
So there's been a number of studies that have come out over the last almost 10 years now, that have talked about the difficulties and the issues in rural schools. The first committee that was looking at this was a group that was formed by the former superintendent of Mohawk Trail that was called the Rural Schools Coalition. That was established in 2006, and it met for a number of years, but there was no such thing as a remote meeting. So it fundamentally was a group of Western Massachusetts school superintendents who were trying to get together and figure out how they could work together. But beginning in 2017, the very first actual report was done. It was called the Updating the Structure and Finance of Mass Regional Schools. That was a report that was done by the auditor, Suzanne Bump, who is a major supporter of Western Mass and rural regions. And that report, the primary conclusions of that was that there was a need to fully fund regional transportation, that there was a need for specialized rural aid for rural districts. She also suggested allowing regional transit authorities to provide some transportation and to provide some funding grants for school districts that were looking to regionalize. The second report that came out was the DESE report on the fiscal conditions of rural schools. That report really was focused on regionalization. While they noted that rural districts do face some unique challenges, they basically said regionalization is the answer. So that was followed in 2008 also by a commission that was established by the legislature to study student transportation. And this wasn't specifically rural, but it did make a number of recommendations that related to rural schools as well as other schools. They suggested, for example, something that we all could hope for was that the Massachusetts general laws be revised to allow for more competition in the school transportation and vendor contracting process, and that we allow parents and guardians to opt out of school transportation so that districts with large transportation areas could consolidate routes more. One of the things we have certainly is fewer students on a school bus, but we have to have a seat for every student that goes to the school. So if parents could opt out, that would certainly be a help. That report was followed in 2019 by the first rural aid in the state budget. That was back Adam Hines and Representative Adam Blay. Senator Hines got that first amount through. That was in 2019. And then that was followed in the next one is the public infrastructure in Western Massachusetts. Again, that was a Suzanne Bump report, and she focused on some of the inequities that dealt with broadband, lack of physical infrastructure in Western Mass that would support economic growth and development, and some changes to the Chapter 90 town funding program that would provide better equity for our towns in the funding of their roads and bridges and so forth. But that was a very substantial report as well. And then we have the granddaddy of them all, which was the Special Commission on the Fiscal Health of Rural Schools. That was as a result of the Student Opportunity Act, the legislature created this commission headed by Representative Blay and Senator Hines. And that is the report that we'll refer to a number of times during this presentation. And in 2023, the first really act to implement the recommendations of the Rural Schools Commission was filed by, again, Natalie Blay, and this time Senator Joe Comerford. And we'll refer to that several times again during this presentation. So that just gives you a bit of a background.
And then our last piece of history is that then in 2024, MASC started the Rural Schools Committee.
Yeah.
So Martha referred to rural aid. Just want to make sure that everybody understands what that is. That is state aid for rural schools that exists completely outside of Chapter 70. It's been a line item in the state budget since 2019. To qualify for rural aid, towns, there are two qualifications. You have to have below average per capita income for the state. So we're not giving rural aid to wealthy towns. And they look at student population sparsity, literally how many students per square mile in your school district. The towns or the school districts that have the lowest student population density become priority one for rural aid. So the priority one districts share 50% of the funding for rural aid that year. The next group shares 30%, and the third priority shares 20%. Because this exists outside of Chapter 70, it is completely reliant on the annual appropriations. We make our school budgets in the spring, but we don't find out until the summer what the appropriation has been. And then DESE does the calculations. We don't know exactly how much we're getting for rural aid until the fall. This year, we didn't find out until I think it was the week before Thanksgiving. So basically 6 months after we have set our school budget for the year. The way that rural aid works, we are so grateful to have that funding, but we can't build it into our annual school budgets. And once we find out in the fall how much we're getting, we still have to spend it by June 30th. So the timing of rural aid is an issue. Here's the history of the funding of rural aid. When Senator Hines got it through in FY19, we got $1.5 million. We were very grateful for that. You can see there was a big jump in FY24, which corresponds to when that rural schools report came out, and they said rural schools really need more funding to meet their basic needs. This year, we got $16 million. Governor Healy has recommended level funding $16 million again going into next year. We are grateful for every bit of assistance we get. And when you look at these figures in relation to the recommendation of the Rural Schools Report, they said the actual needs in 2022 were that rural schools really need $60 million, 60, not 16, to meet their financial obligations. And you might be aware that since 2022, there's been some inflation. So really, we're getting about a quarter of what it's been identified we need.
So one of the first things that the Rural Schools Report put forth was some of the reasons of what are the challenges facing the rural district, and one of the major things is demographics. Certainly, there's been a decline in population, as you can see, and these graphics come right from that report. The three counties that have the most in terms of rural schools are Franklin County, which is where I am, Berkshire County, which is far west, and Barnstable County, which is down on the Cape. And you can see that the population has declined in those areas, 2010 to 2020. That population decline has continued slightly over the last 4 years. But more importantly, if we go to the next slide, the problem is that not only are there fewer people, but there are fewer people in the age group that goes to school. For example, in Franklin County, we now have 16.4% of our population is under 18. In Berkshire County, that's now 15.8%, and in Barnstable, it's 13.7%. And that compares with the state as a whole, which is about 19%. So there are fewer people and fewer of them in in the age bracket that would go to school. So obviously, this has caused a dramatic change in school enrollment in the number of students attending our schools. Again, it's the three counties that are the most rural who have the biggest decline in school population. In my district, our decline over the last 24 years from 2000 to 2024 has been 53%. So that's a big chunk of our issue. Also, challenging in our districts is the fact that we have many small towns. They have a very small property tax base. A number of our towns have little, if any, in terms of a commercial center where you would find some commercial tax to help out the residential tax bracket. And as a result, the tax levies, again, for the counties where the most rural schools are far below the average municipality total tax levy is far below those of the other districts in the state, other counties in the state.
This is my
So those
favorite slide
factors,
in the
yeah, I was just gonna say, those factors combined are the kind of demographic challenge that rural districts in our state are facing.
This is my favorite slide in the deck, and I'll explain the picture before I tell you why it's relevant. This is a beautiful indoor water park in a private home in Leverett, which borders my town. It belongs to the family that founded Yankee Candle. So this is relevant because of the part of Chapter 70 calculations where they calculate our required local contribution based on the expected value of our real estate and our per capita income within the municipality, which should point to how the town's ability to pay, right? So if you're in a large town or a city with tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, and you've got a few really affluent ones, it doesn't make very much difference in your per capita income. In our tiny towns, one or two outliers can really skew those numbers. So this is true for Leverett and this one family. Leverett last year, because of the one family, did not qualify for rural aid. So now they're actually trying to tweak the formulas about who qualifies. It also wreaks havoc. So in my regional district, I'm with the town of Conway, which is a beautiful hill town, feels very pastoral. People tend to move there because they want to feel like they are removed from civilization. It's a lovely place to live. And there are a small number of very affluent families who have moved there, which for years has really increased inappropriately increased the required local contribution that the state expects Conway can afford. Now, none of our towns can actually tax those incomes in order to support our education. We can only raise our levies through property taxes. So those incomes aren't relevant for any of us to how we can actually fund our schools. But then in Conway, so they've been expected to contribute a lot more, and it's part of, our regional assessment and everything. This year, 2 millionaire families moved out. This is great for Conway. Their required local contribution has dropped dramatically. It's much more in line with what they can truly afford. They're not actually a wealthy town. The other piece of that is that now that they have a more realistic required local contribution, the other three towns in the regional are seeing our assessments for the regional jump way up to compensate. So it just causes all sorts of chaos to have these outlying wealthy families in these very small towns. We've already said this once, but we're going to restate this with different words. Per pupil funding does not work for rural schools. We talked about those efficiencies, the economies of scale that we still need a principal and a superintendent when our school only has 100 children in it. We are, as Martha said, we are facing severe declining enrollment in rural towns. Some of our districts have spent decades in hold harmless. And when our student enrollment is declining like that, the Student Opportunity Act formulas don't account for the fixed costs that are still going up. This is very comparable to the arguments about paying tuition for students going to charter schools, that we have to send money to follow the student out, but our in-district costs don't go down when that student leaves. It's exactly the same thing for rural towns. Minimum aid is also not as helpful for our towns as it could be. We talk about, well, we want our minimum aid per pupil this year to be bigger, but the thing is the difference between $30 per student or $104 per student doesn't make that much difference if your school district like mine only has 170 children in it. When we get a really good year of minimum aid funding, it doesn't even fund half of a paraprofessional in my district. So for those of you who would like to see actual numbers, let's look at this example that's drawn straight from the Rural Schools Report. Two hypothetical schools. Our rural school has 200 students in it and 14 classrooms. Our suburban school has 300 students and also 14 classrooms. There is a difference in class size because of this. I would like to say that it is really nice when rural schools are able to have small class sizes, but that is not necessarily the rule for rural schools in general, or even within any given rural school. Because, if we only have 1 or 2 classrooms per grade, we do have sort of demographic bubbles. This class is a big class, this class is a small class. Sometimes it's on the cusp of should it be 1 or 2 classes next year. So the SOA calculations include assumptions about how much it costs per pupil for different cost categories, like how much does it cost per pupil to hire a teacher. So these two hypothetical schools have exactly the same number of teachers. They both have reasonable class sizes, but the rural school, just because the numbers are lower, the enrollment is lower, they get 33% less state aid for exactly the same number of teachers. This is how this formula does not work for rural schools.
So this chart is also came directly from the Rural Schools Report, and it shows the percent difference between a school district with 1,300 students, under 1,300 students, and those over 1,300. The real one that stands out is administration is about 41% higher in districts with under 1,300 students. The special education services are also significantly higher. Insurance and retirement also takes up a bigger proportion of the budget. Now, the foundation budget, it's important to note, assumes that districts have 2,500 students. So when the foundation budget makes assumptions about costs in districts, it's assuming that your district can achieve some economies of scale because you're 1,500, you have a 1,500 student body, which just isn't the case in most rural schools. So if we move to transportation, the lack of state funding for transportation is difficult because there are certainly regular school districts who don't get any transportation assistance, and there are some municipal districts that are almost as large or as large as some of the smaller rural and regional districts. So there are some inequities there, but there are some extraordinary costs that are associated with providing transportation in a district, certainly such as ours, that one of the carrots that was held out to rural districts to incentivize them to form regions was that the Commonwealth would fund 100% of their transportation costs, and that has never ever happened. I think the closest we've ever gotten is 90%. It's also been as low since I've been on the school committee for over 10 years. It's been as low as 50 or 60%. And it's often the first thing that gets chopped off the budget when the Senate and House are negotiating. You know, what can they need to come to an agreement on something, they need to chop something up. Well, regional school transportation has often been one of the things that gets chopped first. We also aren't able to afford late buses that would allow for our students to be able to participate in after-school activities and sports. We can't, and this last one is becoming more and more important. We don't have the funding to transport students to field trips, but also to internships, to our work-study programs, and to help them take advantage of dual enrollment opportunities. That's a real equity issue, because these are the kinds of programs that our students throughout the Commonwealth are becoming more and more interested in, and certainly programs that I think rural schools, at least certainly in my district, we're trying to develop these opportunities, but it makes it more difficult when only a small portion of your student body that can afford to have cars or parents that can bring them to things can actually participate in them. So that's a real equity issue. So how is the next thing we're going to look at a little bit is the Student Opportunity Act. And as I say, when that was passed, I think it was acknowledged that it wasn't designed to help rural school districts or small districts. It was designed to help gateway cities and urban districts that had been underfunded for years and that served specific populations of high need. And certainly, I think every rural district supported that bill and continues to support the SOA. But it has not helped rural school districts by and large, and it has helped some, but you can see from this slide the percentage of districts that are receiving rural aid continues to be extreme. The percentage of those districts that receive only the minimum aid, this year was $104. It's been as low as $30 per student. The percent of the districts receiving rural aid that only get the minimum aid from Chapter 70 is very high. 85% in 2025. Excuse me, I think that actually should have been 78%, but it's still extremely high. And so we wanted to explore a little bit about what that meant and how the SOA and the inflation factor have been a big problem with the SOA. To the extent it can help rural districts, that certainly has made it more difficult. So we're going to turn to our friend Tracy Novick to help us out with this piece.
And you know me, I'm always happy to wave my hands around in front of charts. So I just put a couple of these together. These are I've been in a couple of rural districts recently, and as I've been working through how SOA has been implemented, there's been something that's been sort of highlighted to me that I just wanted to sort of share in the context of what you've just seen from Jessica and Martha as you're talking about, as you're working in your advocacy and so forth. Particularly highlighting that last point that Martha was mentioning in terms of the number of districts that have actually seen hold harmless impacts. And oops, I think I actually may have jumped partway through here. Let's start at the beginning. That would helpful. Okay, so something that I thought was actually really important to note is that absolutely everybody said we were fighting for the gateways, and there was absolute unanimity across the state in terms of everyone doing that. But the thing for the sort of real numbers wonks, we knew that eventually what was going to happen is that it was going to push a number of districts that had been in hold harmless and just receiving minimum aid out of that as implementation happened. And so the first thing I'm going to do is highlight a couple of districts that are more rural where that actually did happen, right? So Mahar, Central Massachusetts, northern part of the state, actually has it has orange in it, which has sort of like a teeny bit of urban and then has a whole bunch of rural around it, actually moved out of hold harmless funding as a result of the Student Opportunity Act and is now receiving foundation aid increases. The one that I'm really excited about that I was kind of waiting for was Central Berkshire Regional. I was actually out in Dalton, I think 2 weeks ago, presenting to them. And they're another one that was sort of on the bubble. You can see any place where there's a yellow line that's below the green. That's a district that's receiving not only hold harmless, it's not only receiving per pupil minimums, but it's also receiving substantial hold harmless funding. Another one that moved out is Central Berkshire in terms of it got pushed straight out of those minimum per pupil increases and into hold harmless funding. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't note that because of declining enrollment, and as as Jessica and Martha clearly pointed out, right, we're talking about a per pupil funding pattern, which is entirely what the foundation budget is. If you have declining enrollment, everything else being equal, you're probably going to end up in a situation where you are not getting foundation aid increases, right? And if that happens year over year over year, the thing that to keep in mind is that you're not the per pupil increases are just the per pupil increases. At the same time, remember that the state always holds you harmless, so you end up getting aid that in many ways is essentially not reflecting your foundation budget at all, right? The two things are completely not associated with each other. And obviously that's certainly the story for Martha's district of Mohawk Regional. There's then a little bit of a trick though. The thing that I thought was actually really interesting, and that if you caught me the last couple of years, you may have seen me wildly waving my hands around in front of slides about, is that there have been several districts, and in particular, I mean, one of the things that we've sort of mentioned in passing that I think is important to highlight is that we think a lot, I think too often, of poverty as being an urban phenomenon. And that actually is really very much not the case. Some of our highest poverty districts that are in those higher groups when we talk about it in terms of the foundation budget are absolutely some of our rural districts. And of course, the way the Student Opportunity Act was supposed to work is that that's supposed to mean your foundation budget goes up. And if you're a district that gets more of your funding from the state than from local communities, that should be pushing you back out into getting foundation aid. Nauset Regional, interestingly to me, is actually one of them. And I know I've wrestled through this with Nauset a couple of times. Nauset's down on the Cape. In FY24, they were only $224,000 away from moving out and into foundation aid. And given, I mean, look at now, granted, we all know we're talking about wildly different sized districts, depending on the size of your district, that may be a huge chunk of your budget or not. But in Nauset's case, it was actually close enough where they were within striking distance. And the problem, and I know that you've all probably heard this story more than once, is that in FY24, the inflation rate for the foundation budget was only 1.35%. And then this year, right, it's 1.93. So we have these 2 years of inflation, and rather than fix that problem, which again is not going to solve the larger sort of contextual issues here, and it's not actually going to help districts like Amherst and Mohawk Trail and Franklin down in South County. But for districts like Nauset, in many of these cases, if we had had a higher inflation rate, they actually would have seen that success and moved that success of the formula and moved into foundation aid. The other one that I thought was interesting is that Old Rochester Regional actually saw this happen, right? We implemented the Student Opportunity Act in 22. In 23, Old Rochester Regional actually saw the implementation. It worked. And then in 24, we had a low enough inflation rate where they got sunk again. And 25 is the same. And the thing to remember, to Jessica's point, is that not only does that per pupil minimum not necessarily help, I would argue, really any of us, because it's kind of never enough for anybody to do anything. It actually then makes the problem worse as we're doing this SOA implementation, because then you have that as part of your hold harmless the next year. And then you add the per pupil increase on top of that. So you see that the difference between that yellow line and the green gets wider every single year over time. And that's what sunk Old Rochester Regional. Sorry for my ship metaphors here today. They seem to be kind of. And Gil Montague was the one that immediately had jumped out at me, because Gil Montague was sort of the first one I saw highlighted, where it was so close to getting out of this hold harmless status and moving into foundation aid. And instead they got stuck because of the low inflation rate. And I know that was testimony that they talked to Senator Comerford. I have to say, by the way, that y'all are well served in terms of your delegations. The case has been made extraordinarily well in the legislature. But Gil Montague is the one that I was absolutely sort of off my rocker about in terms of them getting stuck. So keep this in mind in terms of your picture when you're thinking specifically about the foundation budget. So not in any way sort of touching on the rural aid question, but that the SOA got a lot of was more of a mover, more of sort of a rocket ship. Could have been more of a push for a lot of the districts we're talking about if the inflation rate hadn't been such a kickback for it. And so one of the things, I mean, in terms of things that I'm mourning, because we all worked so hard, of course, to get this passed, is that there's a lot of lost opportunity in terms of the funding that otherwise would be helping districts if we had seen an inflation rate that was much more realistic in these years. And again, doesn't solve the issue, but in terms of putting your picture together for your district when you're advocating, knowing where you're at in terms of this is actually pretty important. And so I appreciated the opportunity to be able to make that point. Any of you who are in districts like this probably have already seen me waving my hands around about it. But I think that that's an important part of this picture as well.
Thanks, Tracy. One thing I think it's important, I hope folks noticed, is on many of those charts, the blue part at the bottom was the minimum required contribution. And I think one of the unintended consequences of, I don't believe it was intended, of the Student Opportunity Act was that as the foundation budget goes up and the amount that the state requires the towns to pay, 59% of that goes up. Even if your school like ours, if you're still on minimum aid, then your towns are picking up their minimum required contribution continues to go up. And if you noticed on those charts, most of the blue bars continue to go up and up and up. But there's no Chapter 70 relief on from the school district side to help keep the above minimum contribution portion of their assessment in check. So that, I think, is
Right.
certainly
Yeah, when that
it's
was
been a
discussed at the
problem.
Foundation Budget Review Commission, they talked about the fact that the statewide average is 29% over, but for
Yeah.
the districts that actually stay straight on the bubble, they were seeing those as real increases in required contribution.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, that was an issue. Anyway, we'll move along. So rural towns are in crisis. We have rising education costs, and our costs of education are intimately connected to the costs that our towns um, are paying, and the problems that our towns are seeing, as well as the schools. Because education consumes such a high percentage of their budget, they are unable to uh, invest in other parts of their town, and that causes some animosity between towns and schools. In some cases, our towns are approaching their levy limits, meaning that they can't raise additional taxes even if they wanted to. There's a town in my district, for example, that pays about 57% of its total town budget on education. Most of the towns in my district are paying somewhere between 53 and 56%. The highest is 57, and that's a lot. And especially as the minimum required contributions go up, they're feeling a lot of pressure because there's nowhere else that they can spend money other on the schools. And so there's little left for them to cut. Their reserves are dwindling, our reserves are dwindling at the same time that student needs are expanding. Post-COVID, I think we all know that students are requiring additional mental health supports, additional academic supports, and these are things that we need to pay for. And it's certainly helping to increase the budgets and the part of our budgets that we're passing along to our towns. So what are the proposed solutions that have been, some of the proposed solutions that have, or we're already trying as rural districts and rural towns? A lot of towns and districts, a lot of districts have begun to have either in-house or external feasibility studies. My district is certainly in the midst of a huge sustainability project with an outside consultant. Berkshire County went through the same thing a couple of years ago. We have regionalized. Many districts have already regionalized. We have closed our community schools where that's politically possible, but that's a really difficult sell because many of these schools are the center of their communities, where town meetings are held, where plays are held, where concerts are held. So it's very, very difficult. We have shared services through things like superintendency unions. And in the case of my district, we share a central office with another district. It's not really a superintendency union, but it's something that we can share and bring the cost down for both of our towns. We have also reduced staff. Again, and that's part of the problem. We reduce staff, we've cut programming, most of which is the electives, the arts, languages, sports, and so forth. And what happens when you start to do that is that people who can leave the district through school choice do. And because school choice requires the parents to drive the kids to school, there's no transportation. You have parents and families who can afford to do that, to move when they see programming and staffing being cut, they move to a different school district, leaving behind those who cannot afford to do that. And that's what we call the death spiral. Once that starts and people start to move out, you are ended up with a very much smaller student population, and it consists of those who cannot do anything else. So we have opened our schools to school choice. It's a double-edged sword because we certainly get income from school choice, but it costs my district about $1.3 million for school choice and charter expenses. And certainly if we could keep those kids and they weren't going to school choice, that would help a lot. And we're certainly trying to do that. We've also, as all districts have, are trying to keep a tight lid on every single expense line item. And rural districts currently pay 18 of the 20 lowest average teachers' salaries in the state. So that's how we've already moved on and what we've already done.
On that last issue about the lowest average teacher salaries, I mentioned at the beginning that I was a teacher in a rural school, and that's what brought me to run for school committee. It's actually my school committee origin story draws a straight line back to one of those Mass Live listicles about the lowest paying districts in the state. And I brought that to the Sunderland School Committee. I was like, it's a negotiations year. What are you going to do about this? And they're like, you should run. So when I was teaching in this rural school, over 2 years, I saw a really high number of beloved colleagues who I thought I was going to be teaching with for the next 20 years leave for a neighboring school district that was not a rural district, not a low population district, where just by crossing one town line, they were making $10,000 to $12,000 more in salary, and that didn't account for a really significant difference in benefits as well. So the school back then and also since then, because I have also left by now, has had substantial faculty and staff turnover. So they've lost a lot of institutional knowledge, lost lots of relationships with the families in that town. And rural schools with low salaries are really struggling to retain staff. Just wanted to make that point. Another solution that we hear a lot about is regionalization. In particular, we've noticed that legislators who don't represent any rural districts or any rural towns really believe that regionalization could fix all of our issues. We could just be more efficient if we did that. And there are some ways that's true. I'll be transparent that I am in favor of more regionalization for my own district. Right now, we're 4 towns with 5 school committees, and we can't afford to fully regionalize K through 12. We've got 4 K6 committees and schools, and then we've got the 7 through 12 regional school. By and large, rural towns have already regionalized. We've got 106 towns that are impacted by receiving rural aid right now. Only 9 of them are municipal K-12 districts. So almost all of the rural aid towns have already regionalized or participate in a superintendency union. So let's talk about some of the problems with regionalization. First of all, we are so stretched with our money, we can't spare extra money to pay for like feasibility studies or to do the implementation. Some districts, notably Martha's, also Gateway Regional and some others, really have already regionalized to their geographic max, where we've got kids spending pretty unreasonable amounts of time on the bus already. I can't remember if Martha already said, but when we've got kids spending an hour on the bus each direction, there's no late bus, so they can't do after school activities. They can't do sports if their families can't drive that hour themselves to do the pickup. Those kids that we don't have great Wi-Fi, great cell signals out here. So you don't have a reliable cell signal to get homework done on the bus. That's 2 hours a day that's lost for your learning. Kids, because they're spending all that time on the bus, they can't work an after school job. So our rural students really are not having the same educational opportunities as their non-rural peers. Another challenge about regionalization is that school districts that might merge into a region, and this is the case for my superintendency union, have divergent contracts. My understanding is that Mass General Law says when school districts merge in a region, into a regional, basically nobody can take a pay cut. So you combine your 2 pay scales and you have to take the highest figure for every given position on the pay scale. And you have to give everybody the highest possible benefits package. So everybody moves up to the highest of everything, and just compensating your staff on the first year of regionalization is an enormous expense. And you really can't start to cut expenses before you've done that regionalization, because otherwise your annual town meeting voters won't approve the regionalization. Annual town meeting voters really want to protect their local control. They want to make sure that they have their own say, that they are not subject to the whims of other towns. And they're really concerned about closing schools. Martha, can you tell us what happened in Heath?
Yeah, we had one part of an earlier regionalization or sustainability effort that we undertook in about 2017. One of the first things that we wanted to try and do was to consolidate schools. We had a school that had about 60 kids in it, and we worked very hard with the town to get them to agree to close that school and send their children to a different school, under a tuition agreement that they would then try to regionalize with that particular district. they closed the school, and it's been very, very difficult for the town. The town, it's basically split the town in half. The school, they have this empty building. It's a beautiful building. It was actually constructed in the 1990s, so it wasn't that old. Um, and part of the town wanted to sell it to a buyer that's other parts of the town was not interested in selling it to. It was a cannabis, either warehouse or a distributor or something. And so that really divided the town. And the town remains somewhat divided over this issue. So it's not easy for small towns to make this decision. And even when it is made, it sometimes, doesn't work out 100% the way one had hoped. So that was a very difficult situation that remains.
So let's look at some other possible solutions that could come from the legislature. First of all, we've already discussed rural aid. We found that 30 states have something comparable to our rural aid program, but we've talked about how right now it's subject to appropriations. We don't know how much we're getting. We can't plan our budgets around it. And it could go down any year, or it could even be subject to 9C cuts. We could have piecemeal legislation that addresses different pieces of things that are challenges for rural schools, many of which are also challenges for non-rural schools. There is also currently the Rural Schools Bill, which we're going to talk about, which is sort of an omnibus bill that includes many of these things that we could just pass just as a single package. And this is, if it could come true the right way, this is kind of what I think of as the holy grail. We would love to, in the reopening of Chapter 70, have a population sparsity factor so that the additional expense of educating children in rural districts is accounted for in Chapter 70, so that when we get our cherry sheet in January, we've got a good idea of what kind of state funding we're getting, and that it should be fair and equitable to the expenses of educating children in rural towns.
So some of the concerns that we've discussed today are also concerns for every district. And we're hoping that folks realize that some of the issues that we're raising are also issues that are important to everyone. Special education funding reform, the full funding of circuit breaker. We all face those issues of rising special education costs. Charter school tuition reimbursement is important to everyone. Ending the one bidder contract transportation contract. We've all had the experience where you get 5 bidders to the bidders conference and you have one bidder that actually submits a bid. And the MASC Delegate Assembly actually passed a resolution dealing with this back in 2023. Fully funding transportation for not only regional districts, but for homeless students, for out-of-district vocational transportation, and for the transportation of foster children, important to a lot of districts, and guaranteeing or trying to improve the adequacy of the workforce for special education, especially. These are things that we certainly feel, but they're also things that I think every district can share those same concerns. So we're all working on those areas together. Most of these issues are covered in the Rural Schools Bill, which has just been introduced to the legislature in this session. We want to shout out very much to our 2 key supporters, Senator Joe Comerford of Northampton and Representative Natalie Blais, who represents most of my district and a lot of the rural districts in northwestern Massachusetts. They have been real stars in pushing the rural school effort. So they've introduced a bill that has a number of things that are very important to all of us. The it contains provisions for out-of-district transportation funding, for foster care transportation. It creates a special education finance commission to study the whole problem of how the Commonwealth funds its special education programs, out-of-district tuition reimbursement for special education students, strengthening the pipeline of special education teachers. It also, very importantly, contains the $60 million recommendation for rural aid that was made in the Rural Schools Report, fully funding regional transportation. It also would add a rural member or rural members to the Board of Secondary Education. Right now, there's not a rural representative on that board. In it, I would ask DESE to re-examine some of the regulations that they promulgate as they relate to rural schools, because one size definitely does not fit all. I think we all know that, but certainly they don't relate to rural schools. And finally, to just give some financial support for regionalization, for funding regionalization studies, for funding the transition costs. Those are all things that are included in this latest version of the rural schools bill. So it's currently co-sponsored by a number of senators and representatives. So this is the reintroduction of the bill that was originally sponsored in the session before this, and they came out totally unrecognizably. So we're very happy that that Joe Comerford and Natalie Blaze have done this reintroduction.
So in the last session, when that rural schools bill was reported out favorably, but almost all of the provisions had been removed, MASC responded in a really powerful way. They said, you know what, it's time for a new committee. So they sponsored us to start the Rural Schools Committee and invited Martha and me to co-chair it. I believe it's the first new committee for MASC in 30 years. I'd like to draw your attention to the beautiful map on this slide showing the hometowns of our 23 members of the committee. I bet that MASC has never had a committee with this type of geographic distribution before. We're very proud of it. So we've been meeting since last May, and we've got a few priorities right now, which are really focused on the legislature. First of all, we are passionately asking for full funding of rural aid in FY26. We understand what the landscape is. We're just trying. We're also asking all of our legislators to co-sponsor and actively support the rural schools bill we just discussed. And in general, we're just trying to educate the legislators on what is going on in rural school districts. There are a number of legislators, particularly representatives, who only represent 1 or 2 towns that receive rural aid, and they might not have heard from them yet. We want to make sure that every legislator who represents a rural town knows about this and can advocate at every opportunity for our needs. We have put some more resources on the internet. If you've got more questions, ruralschoolsma.org we've had for about 2 years now. Below, there's a screenshot here of the homepage, and if you go to the website and you click on the map, it's kind of interactive that you can mouse over and see town names if you want to see which towns are receiving rural aid. And also this tinyurl.com, I can't see it, /ruralma, will bring you to a Drive folder with supporting documents, including all of the reports that we mentioned in the history, and the language and section by section analysis of the rural schools bill. So with that, if there are questions, we'd love to have a discussion.
It looks like the one question we have so far is about per capita income. Would either of you like to take this, or would you like me to take a stab at it?
I would love to hand this to Tracy.
I will, because I will always happily defer to the two of you. By the way, that was a tour de force, and I am ongoingly impressed at the work that you all are doing. The reason, so it's actually interesting, Stacy. And so the question is, if per capita income does not reflect what a town could pay towards education, as is often pointed out when I explain Chapter 70, why do we include that? Because all we actually take money from is actually the property taxes. I'm going to point you back to Jessica's really amazing. I assumed that was actually like AI. I didn't realize that was actually a real picture of a real house. Okay, so the problem with just doing property taxes is that, in fact, it's many of communities like the ones we're talking about, and I'll happily turn the floor back over to Jessica and Martha to talk about that, that may have a lot of residences that are worth a lot of money that are actually second homes. And so there isn't necessarily anything going back into the community save the property taxes. And so it was actually a coalition from the Berkshires and the Cape that got income added to the combined effort yield calculation to essentially try to rebalance. And then that's the explanation, but I'm going to turn it over to the two of you who live it.
Well, no, I mean, I guess that is the explanation, but I think the what's happened again is that we have people who are moving out here who are retired, who maybe owned a business or something, and they come out and then they sell the business, and that they get a one-time huge amount, from the sale of the business, and all of a sudden your income factor goes way up. We've had in the same town of Heath that I was talking about before, we had a lottery winner, won $1 million. Great. That pushed their minimum required contribution way up again. It's the impact of having those small things in a small town. So we're hoping for also a relook at the whole minimum required contribution, how that's calculated. I think that's as necessary as anything is. I did see that Jane Oakes had a hand up. I saw what I saw on my screen. Jane is a school committee chair in Gil Montague, and I don't know if she still had a question or. Looks like
Jane,
you
you
could
can
unmute.
talk now if you have a question.
Yes, I had to unmute myself, which takes me a moment, as all things do on the computer. Just a couple of quick comments, actually. I have some good news, because when I met with Representative Whips earlier this week, she has signed on to the rural schools bill. As we were talking, she definitely understands the issues. We had a great meeting. And just another comment about what a small population does to the budget in a lot of ways. About 5 or 6 years ago, we were over 1,000 students. Now we're in the 900s, and even a slight shift year to year also acts to make it difficult. In the two years, in the last years of the Student Opportunity Act, we did okay, but then we had a slight drop in enrollment the next year, and that was enough to hold us back and hold harmless. Even the rural schools money, we had been in priority 3 until this year. We've moved to priority 2, but we have this sweet spot, as the financial manager said. If we're down to 916, which is not a good thing, but if we go up to 922, we'll drop back to priority 3 for rural schools money. So you want more students, but you don't want too many more students, but all the moving pieces make it really complicated. And yes, so I'm really happy to be part of the rural schools subcommittee to try to do what we can. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Can we take Carrie Green, who also has her hand up, and then move back to the Q&A? Carrie disappeared. Guess we'll go to the Q&A.
No, I'm here. I just
Oh,
didn't
okay, there you are. Okay.
take a minute for the audio. Come on. So Carrie Green, Mount Greylock, and MASC Division 6, thank you so much for all of your work on this. I just want to put in a little bit of a plug for regionalization. We were able to accomplish an expanded region in 2015, and we were relatively creative on how we did it in terms of our agreement. And there are ways to accomplish it and to fully share administrative staff, see real cost efficiencies, align curriculum, have a district staff that is really looking pre-K-12. I would just encourage folks to not discount regionalization if and when it could be appropriate for your districts. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you. Can I
absolutely.
ask some questions about your regionalization? Because like I said before, I would love for my district to fully regionalize K-12. Were your districts, did they have very comparable pay scales and benefits before they merged?
The contracts were different, and what we did is we gradually brought them together. So it was over a period of time, and we sunset some of the clauses that were exceptional for one contract or the other. So it wasn't an all at once, and I think that really helped the teachers to come around on that. And the other thing that we did, which was unique to our district, but I think it has perhaps been looked into by other districts, is that we have a regional high school, regional middle school, high school, and then 2 K-12 or pre-K-12 schools. And so we arranged the agreement so that each town pays for its elementary school, and then they share the apportionment of the middle high school where they're sending their kids. So one town didn't have to feel like it was paying for the other town's elementary school if one town was paying a higher apportionment than another for the regional. So that's what I'm saying is there are some creative ways to think about it that can work for your towns and really assuage some of the concerns that come with regionalization, which seems very scary, but doesn't have to be. Thanks. I'm happy to talk with you further, Jessica, at some point.
Thank you.
And
I
I
appreciate that.
just want to acknowledge that it is 1, so we know it's lunchtime. If some of you need to get off, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. I'm gonna let the questions that are already in the chat here get answered before we actually close up here.
So Stacy Schultze is asking if seasonal designated communities could be used to weigh in on these conversations. And I see Tracy might already be starting to answer that.
No, I just was marking it as we were answering it live.
Okay.
I'm not,
That
I'm
is
not
a,
familiar at all with
I was gonna
seasonal.
say, I don't know anything to answer about that. So
Yeah, I don't
it's, I
either.
guess it's a good question is the answer.
It's a
Yeah,
very good question. I had never heard of it either.
I'm gonna check it out.
Okay, so something that might be good, actually, let's take that last one, Liz, just maybe, what is the best way of getting a hold of Martha and Jessica? Since that's an easy, quick one to answer and following up
Sure.
later might be.
Email is probably the best. My email is very easy. mthurber@mtrsd, Mohawk Trail Regional School District.org. So mthurber@mtrsd.org will get you to me.
Yep.
Jessica?
We're both very easy to find on the internet. I'm with the Frontier Regional District, so jessica.corwin@frsu38.org. But if you just search, Frontier Regional Jessica Corwin, you should be able to find me pretty easily.
Yeah.
And if you forget that, if you email Liz and I, we can absolutely get you in touch with them.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
always
I
happy
know
to
you
answer
have our
questions.
emails.
Happy to answer questions, definitely.
So there's one more here. Some rural schools have unique programs central to their existence. Is there a way to fund special programming in these schools?
I think it's that, I mean, that's hard. Some of the special programs that are going on in our schools, for example, Hollamont, which is a pre-K to 6 school that we share our central office services with, has a program called Hollamont Agriculture and You. It's called a HAY program. It really focuses on teaching kids about agriculture. They take care of animals that are housed at the school. They learn how to feed them. They use agriculture and the animals as a way to learn math, as a way to learn English, a way to write essays about it. That program is partially funded by grants. I think it's hard to get individual funding, state funding for those kinds of programs, but we're always on the lookout for funding for the specific kind of programming that make our schools different. But yeah, we'd love to have that. I think there's one more.
And then there is still a question in Christie's. Yeah, go ahead, please.
There's one more that just says oh, I'm sorry, was somebody gonna?
Go ahead,
It
Martha.
just says if your representatives are already on board, what
Yeah.
actions would you suggest to support the cause?
I think asking them to co-sponsor the legislation, not to just and to actively talk with their colleagues who are not necessarily representing rural districts. Because I think as we tried to show today, there are a lot of things that we have in common. And so if your representative can talk with others in their House or Senate chamber about these issues, that would be helpful. We have great legislators out here in Western Mass, and I think also on the Cape in terms of those who are supportive, but they can also encourage others to consider these issues as well. So I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, we've been finding that it makes a difference whether you ask your legislator generally to support or to make it a high priority, one of their top priorities, particularly when it's coming to the FY26 budget. Please make fully funding rural aid one of your top priorities for the budget. You can also pass a resolution by your school committee and send it off to the Joint Committee on Education. In the future, hopefully we're going to get another hearing for the rural schools bill. We can testify. I'm hoping that this time we're going to be able to bring a lot more students to pack the room for that bill hearing. So there are things we can be doing to push this along.
And I think MASC would encourage, if you're going to send an email, by all means, follow up with a phone call or a handwritten communication. Also, when you're asking for something, which is typically what legislators hear, make a point if your particular legislator or legislators have done something that you feel really good about. Email, certainly shoot an email or make a quick phone call. And thank them for that. It's good that if you can make a connection, your voice sometimes is heard a little bit louder. Is that right, Tracy?
I think that's right. And I think that's even a good place to end. So I
Yes.
want to thank Martha and Jessica for all of their work, not only today, but in general, because there's obviously tons and tons and tons of hours and, time and worry and everything else that's going into this work. Those of you who are on the Rural Schools Committee, thank you also for your work, for making sure you're representing your students and your community so well. Yes, the slides will be available. Yes, the recording will be available. We'll make sure that we share it. And with that, I'm just going to wish you a good weekend. Thanks for being here.
Can I
Thanks very
just
much.
add one more thing? If you
Of
all have
course.
the opportunity to look at the website that Mohawk Trail, is it 8 Towns? Martha will tell us what the website is, but they have done
Yeah.
a ton of work in their current sort of analysis around sustainability. That is hard to keep up with, but if you have any specific questions, you should go to that website and have a look around and see what you might be able to find that kind of
Thanks for mentioning that, Liz. That's very true. We've done a ton of work. It's called 8 districts, 8 towns, 2 districts.org. And the numbers are just the number, and that has a ton of information, not only about our district, but in general. There's a lot of briefs on things like middle schools and do they 6th grade belong in middle school or not? I mean, it relates to other districts. So take a look.
Excellent recommendation. Thank you for bringing that in.
Yeah.
All right.
All
Have
right.
a good
Thank you,
weekend, all.
guys.
Thank you.
everyone.